A man bought a silent girl for $19, but what she carried broke the town in half. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where shadows speak and forgotten voices come alive. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to bring more powerful stories to life. Now listen closely. It was just $19. No questions asked, no paperwork, no goodbyes, just a barefoot girl, silent and bruised, standing beside the church steps like a ghost someone wanted to forget. Elias, a quiet widower with a broken fence and a buried past, bought her without a word. The town looked the other way, but when she stepped onto his land, the wind changed. Doors slammed. People whispered. Some said she was cursed. Others said she'd burned a house down once with someone still inside. But no one, absolutely no one, was ready for the truth she carried in her silence. A truth that would split the town in half, uncover buried sins, and turn a quiet farmhouse into the center of a storm. This isn't just a story. This is a reckoning. They gathered like they always did when something unholy was about to happen. Shoulders hunched, arms folded, eyes darting behind curtains or between hat brims, pretending not to look. It was the kind of crowd that smelled of tobacco and old fear, and still nobody spoke. Not when the preacher stepped forward. Not when the hammer hit the wood. Not even when the girl appeared. She wasn't crying. That would have made her seem more human. She was just standing. Small, barefoot, skin the color of late winter. Her dress hung too loose at the collar and too tight at the wrist. Her left shoe was missing. Her braid was so tightly wound it looked painful. And the only sound she made was when the preacher asked for her name. She whispered, not to him, not really to anyone, "Please don't let them find me." That was all. Elias was leaning on the fence post farthest from the noise. Some said he'd lost his mind when his wife died. Others said he'd buried the wrong child. But when he stepped forward, silver coins clinking against each other in his hand, the crowd finally shifted, just slightly, just enough for judgment to slip through the cracks in their silence. He said nothing. He didn't ask how old she was. Didn't ask why her sleeve was torn. Just counted out $19 and placed them on the table like he was buying seed. The preacher looked at him hard, then at the girl, then at the coins. Nobody stopped it. Nobody said her father shouldn't have. Nobody asked where her mother had gone. When Elias walked away, the girl followed, limping behind him like a shadow that hadn't fully decided whether to stay or vanish. They passed the old mill, the saloon, the blacksmith shop with its smoking roof. No one spoke. Some looked. Most didn't. By the time they reached the wagon, the sun was already beginning to sag behind the ridge. Elias lifted the girl up by the arm. Not rough, not gentle, just enough, and sat her beside the feed sacks. She didn't look at him. He didn't ask her to. No one knew why he did it. Not the preacher. Not the sheriff. Not even Elias himself. Maybe, but as the dust from the wagon wheels curled behind them and the town faded into orange dusk, some swore the air turned colder. Not the kind of cold that comes from weather, but the kind that settles inside a place when something long buried has just been unearthed. What no one knew then, what only the wind might have heard, was that Elias hadn't saved her. Not yet. In fact, for the first few miles, he wasn't sure if she was real. She sat too still, breathed too quiet, kept her hands folded like someone had told her once if she moved, she'd be punished. It wasn't until he glanced sideways and saw her lips moving, no sound, just movement, that he realized she was praying, or pretending to, or remembering how. The town would talk, of course. It always did. A man buys a girl for less than a bag of flour. There would be whispers. There would be questions. But Elias wasn't thinking about the town. He was thinking about the eyes of the girl who wouldn't look at him. He was thinking about how someone gets that quiet, and what had been done to her to make her stay that way. The sun was almost gone when they reached the edge of his land. The house was a crooked thing made of wood and grief. The porch still sagged from the last storm. He tied the horse, lifted her down, opened the door. She didn't move, just stood there, looking at the porch steps like they might break beneath her. He didn't rush her, didn't speak, just went inside. And a minute later, with the sky bleeding its last light over the wheat fields, she stepped in too, slow, silent, carrying nothing. or so he thought. But what she carried wasn't in her hands. That IT was deeper, that IT was heavier, and it would, in time, split the town in half. They called it a town, but it never really felt like one. Whisper Hollow wasn't on any map that mattered, and if you blinked while passing through, you'd miss it entirely. Just a handful of buildings warped by time and weather, paint peeling from porch rails, wind chimes made of broken spoons, and fences that leaned like they'd given up pretending. Nothing here was loud, not the people, not the animals, not even the wind. And yet, everything was heard. Everything. In Whisper Hollow, your secrets didn't stay in the walls. They grew roots in the floorboards, bloomed in the dust, and slipped out through keyholes when no one was looking. Maeve didn't speak much, but the town spoke for her. They said she'd once been locked in a cellar for 3 days after biting her father's hand. They said she'd set fire to the stables when she was 12. No one died, but the smoke left streaks on the church windows that never quite came clean. They said a boy from the South pasture went missing for a week and came back changed. Didn't talk after that. Just carved things into trees and stared at his own shoes like they scared him. Some folks said Maeve had been seen near the bluff that night, barefoot and humming. The boy never said. He never said anything again. Maeve lived at the edge of everything. The last house before the road turned to gravel and the gravel to weeds. She walked to town alone once a week, always at dusk, always with a list. Flour, thread, sometimes salt if there was enough money. She paid in exact coins, didn't linger, didn't look up. The women behind the counter always asked if she needed help. She always shook her head. Her voice, when it came, was thin and misplaced, like it belonged to someone else. She didn't go to church. Not after what happened that summer. No one said exactly what it was, but old Mrs. Lunt swore she heard screaming from the back pew, and that the preacher's wife left in tears. After that, the family stopped showing up altogether. Her mother was seen less and less, her face pale and drawn, always clutching a cloth at her side like she might unravel if she let go. Her father came into town only to collect wages, sharpening tools, patching fences, cleaning soot from chimneys no one used. And Maeve? Maeve just kept walking. Same day, same time, same limp, never faster than needed, never slower than allowed. It was the scar they remembered most. Pale, tight, and curved just beneath her jaw, like someone tried to silence her but left it half finished. The limp was newer, maybe from the fire, maybe from the winter she didn't wear shoes. But the scar had been there as long as anyone could remember. Kids would whisper that it glowed in the moonlight. One boy swore he saw it twitch when she was angry. No one dared to ask her. Whisper Hollow didn't need proof to believe. It needed silence, a pause too long, a look held too steadily. And that was enough. Maeve gave him all that, and more. She gave him mystery. She gave them something to pass between hands at dusk, something to stitch into conversation like a warning thread. In a town so small, so starved for anything new, she became their favorite ghost. Not dead, just forgotten in all the ways that mattered. She never answered when spoken to, but she was always listening. Her eyes would flick toward movement. Her hands would tighten around her basket when someone got too close. Once, she dropped a spool of thread in the mercantile and didn't pick it up, just stared at it like it had turned into something else, something she didn't want to touch. The shopkeeper bent to grab it for her, but she had already walked out the door. No one chased after her. By the time she turned 19, most folks had stopped using her name altogether. She was just the girl, the one with the scar, the one who didn't belong. And maybe she didn't, but no one could say why. Not out loud, not even to themselves. It was just a feeling, like a storm waiting in the bones, like a song stuck in your teeth that you didn't remember learning. And when Elias' car brought her into town in the back of his wagon, bruised and silent, the town didn't ask where she'd been. It asked what she'd done to deserve it. The cabin wasn't much. A slanted roof, walls patched with years, windows that let in more wind than light. It stood just past the wheat fields, a half-day's ride from town, far enough that no one came uninvited, close enough that Elias could still hear the bells when the wind blew right. It had once been a home. Now, it was just a place where no one knocked. The girl stepped inside, like she wasn't sure the floor would hold her weight. She didn't ask where to sit, didn't ask anything. Elias didn't offer. He pointed to the spare cot near the hearth, then went out to untie the horse. By the time he came back, she was standing in the same spot, hands clasped, eyes lowered. The fire had gone out, but she hadn't moved. He didn't tell her to do anything. Didn't tell her not to either. But the next morning, the floors had been swept. By midday, the woodpile had grown by 3 logs. And by evening, there was soup on the stove, thin, quiet soup, the kind that filled the room with warmth, even if no one tasted it. Elias didn't comment. He just ate. She didn't sit at the table. Just waited until he finished, then took the bowl and washed it in silence. For days, this went on. No questions. No explanations. Only small things. A dish left out. A window latched. Boots placed side by the door, as if someone had finally remembered what it meant to live where no one watched. She kept her scarf on those first few days, pulled low over her brow, tied around her ears like armor. But by the 4th morning, it was folded on the edge of the cot. Her braid was still too tight, but her hands weren't. Elias worked outside mostly. Fence repairs, water pump, stable gate. She never followed, but he noticed the window curtains moved when he passed. Sometimes in the evenings, she sat on the steps of the porch, knees drawn in, eyes fixed on the sky like it might offer an answer. He sat too, not beside her, not at first, just near enough for his silence to feel less sharp. The dogs lay between them. No one spoke, but the quiet was different now. Less like absence, more like space. It happened on the 7th night. She was drying a dish, one of the good ones, the kind that had belonged to someone before sorrow set in. Her fingers slipped. It shattered against the edge of the stove, sharp, sudden, final. She froze. The air did too. Her whole body tensed like she'd stepped into lightning. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Just breath. Quick and frightened. She didn't reach for the broom. She didn't look at him. She waited. Elias didn't yell. Didn't sigh. He looked at her. Not the floor, not the broken dish, not the mistake, and said simply, "We have more." 4 words. That's all. But they landed heavy, like something sacred. She blinked. He moved toward the broom. She flinched just slightly, her back brushing the wall, but he didn't stop. Didn't change pace. Just held the broom out, handle first, slow and steady. She took it. That was the first time their eyes met. After that, she began leaving her hair loose. Not always. Not yet. But enough that he noticed the way it caught the light when she moved through the doorway. He started fixing the porch roof too, not because it needed it, but because she sat out there more. Sometimes with a needle and thread, sometimes with nothing at all. Just her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road that led nowhere. He never asked about the scar. He saw it clearer now in the morning light, a pale reminder beneath her jaw that something had once gone very wrong. But he said nothing, and she didn't offer. That was their unspoken agreement. If the past came knocking, they'd let the dogs bark, but they wouldn't open the door. There was no moment when they became familiar. No switch flipped, no line crossed, just 1,000 small things. A spoon placed near a mug, a blanket folded different, a sigh shared at dusk. And when she began humming, soft, tuneless, barely there, he didn't say a word, just listened. Because in a place like that, where even the wind walked carefully, sound was a kind of trust. She didn't speak, but she stayed, and sometimes that was louder than any name. He arrived just past sundown, riding a black horse with a torn saddle and eyes like burnt glass. Burke Montrell didn't knock. He never had to. The town knew when danger stepped off a horse and stretched its shoulders. He rode slow, hat pulled low, the kind of swagger that only came from a man who'd never once been told no and meant it. He smelled like sweat and smoke and something older, something rotting underneath. He tied his horse outside the saloon, leaned against the rail, and asked the first boy who passed where the car place was. The boy didn't answer, just ran. By nightfall, everyone knew. They always did. Burke claimed he had papers. Folded, yellowed things with crooked ink and signatures that didn't belong to anyone worth remembering. Transfer of guardianship, he said, like the words themselves could erase what had been done. Said he'd been promised a wife. Said he'd been cheated. Said she was his. The sheriff told him to leave. Politely at first, then firmer. But Burke just smiled, wide and toothy, like a man who'd seen worse than rejection and walked away laughing. "I'll wait," he said. "One way or another, she's coming back." He set up camp just past the river bend, close enough that the smoke from his fire curled into town like warning. Every night, he sharpened his knife by lantern light, humming some broken tune. Every morning, he rode closer. Never stepped onto the property, but always close enough to see the porch. And then, on the third night, he left something behind at a rope, rough, coarse, knotted at the end, looped like a noose, and hung from Elias's front gate. It swung slightly in the wind, creaking with every breath of night. No note, no name, just a message. "I remember." Maeve saw it before Elias did. She didn't scream, didn't speak, just stared at it until her hands began to shake and the bowl she was drying slipped from her fingers and cracked on the floor. She didn't pick it up, didn't explain, just walked outside, barefoot, into the snow. By the time Elias reached the porch, she was gone. He didn't panic, not on the outside. He looked at the tracks, shallow in the fresh powder, watched the direction they led south, toward the canyon where the wind howled through rock like morning. He didn't ask why. He didn't call her name. He just saddled the horse, wrapped an extra coat under his arm, and rode. He found her near dawn, curled beneath an overhang of stone, knees to her chest, face buried in her arms like she was trying to disappear into herself. Her shawl was thin, soaked through. Her boots were gone. She didn't look up, didn't flinch. When he knelt beside her, she didn't move, just trembled. Elias didn't speak right away. He pulled off his coat, wrapped it around her shoulders. She tensed but didn't resist. He sat beside her, legs stretched into the snow, eyes on the horizon where the stars were fading. And then, only then, he said it. "You're not a debt," he whispered, "and never were." She turned her face just slightly, enough for him to see the ice on her lashes. Her lips parted, but no words came. Just breath, warm and fragile. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. But when he stood and held out his hand, she took it. They didn't speak the whole ride back. But somewhere along the way, she leaned into his chest, not out of weakness but choice. The rope was gone when they returned, but the memory of it stayed. Spring didn't arrive with flowers in Whisper Hollow. It came slowly, like someone knocking on a door they weren't sure they had the right to. The frost melted in patches. The wind softened just enough to let the curtains breathe. And in the quiet that followed, Maeve began to move differently. Not faster, not louder, just less like a shadow. She asked Elias for seeds one morning. Didn't say what kind, just pointed at the patch of dry earth near the fence where the sun landed first. He handed her a pouch. Onions, beans, something wild that had blown in from someone else's garden. She didn't plant in rows. She scattered, like she wasn't trying to control the earth, just ask it for permission. By the end of the week, she was out there every day. Sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands in dirt, hair tied back with a piece of linen that used to be a dishcloth. She didn't hum. Not yet. But her silence had changed shape. It was no longer heavy. It waited instead, like something about to unfold. She began dyeing the curtains too. Boiled bark and flower petals in a pot over the fire until the air smelled like bitter honey. Hung them on the line, let them drip. The old cloth took the color unevenly, blotched and imperfect, but when the light passed through it at dusk, the whole room looked softer, warmer, like it belonged to someone who hoped, even a little. The filly was the first one to trust her, skittish thing. Legs too long, eyes too wide. Wouldn't let anyone near, not even Elias. But Maeve didn't rush. She sat on the edge of the pen each morning, just watching. Sometimes with an apple, sometimes just with her hands in her lap. It took 9 days. Then one morning, the filly stepped close. Sniff her palm. Let her stroke its neck. After that, she followed, Maeve like a twin. People noticed, they always did. Whisper Hollow didn't forget, but it watched. And when Maeve walked through town with a jar of preserves in one hand and thread in the other, no one spit at her feet anymore. They didn't greet her either, but the space around her changed. It widened, softened. One woman, a widow with 4 sons and tired eyes, left a loaf of bread on their porch. Another brought a skein of wool, dyed pale blue, and said it was leftover. No one said sorry. No one said welcome. But a silence that had once been sharp was now just quiet. Elias saw it too. The way she stood straighter. The way her hands didn't tremble when she poured tea. He started carving again, late into the evenings. Little things. Leaves. Horseshoes. Half-finished shapes he tucked into a box by the window. One night, he left something on the table. Small, no bigger than his thumb. A sparrow, rough-hewn but unmistakable. Perched with its wings folded, its beak slightly open like it might speak if you listen long enough. Maeve didn't touch it at first, just stared. Then, slowly, she picked it up, ran her thumb along the grain, and smiled, not wide, not bright, just enough for the corners of her mouth to rise, enough for the scar on her jaw to soften, enough for Elias to look up from his cup and blink like he wasn't sure it had really happened. Later that night, as they sat on the porch with the sun dragging its heels across the hills, she placed the sparrow on the rail beside her. Let it catch the last light. Then she said, quiet as a breath, "My safe place." Elias didn't respond, didn't need to. The words hung in the air like warmth from a fire that wasn't burning anymore, but had once been enough to save them both. The letter came folded into thirds, pressed flat like someone had taken too long to decide whether or not to send it. It didn't arrive with fanfare. No writer. No knock. Just the quiet thump of envelope on wood as Elias brought in the morning mail, dust still clinging to the porch rail. He didn't open it. Just placed it on the table and waited. Maeve found it after supper. She didn't speak for a long time after reading. Just held the letter like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. Her fingers trembled, not out of fear, but something deeper, something older. When she finally looked up, her eyes weren't wet, but they were hollow in a way that Elias hadn't seen since the snow. "She's sick," she said. He didn't ask who. He already knew. "Wants to see me," she added, voice flat. "Says she's sorry. Says she left to protect me." He waited. Let the silence catch its breath. "I want to go," she said, "but not to stay." Elias nodded once that he didn't ask her not to. Didn't offer to come. Just wrapped bread and dried apples into a cloth and placed it in the wagon. By dawn, she was gone. The road south was long, but the days held. No rain, no breakdowns, just dust and quiet and 1,000 memories she hadn't invited riding alongside her. The last time she'd seen her mother, there had been no goodbye, just a slammed door and a hand that didn't reach back. The house she arrived at was small, whitewashed, with lemon balm growing along the steps and a silence that felt practiced. Inside, everything smelled of salt and bleach and time trying to be undone. Her mother lay on a cot, smaller than Maeve remembered, her hair thinner, her wrists like sticks wrapped in gauze. She opened her eyes slowly, like it cost her something. "La," she rasped, the name she hadn't spoken in years. Maeve didn't rush to her, didn't kneel, just stood by the doorway and let the moment stretch. "I tried," her mother whispered, "to save you." Maeve swallowed. "No," she said. "You ran." Her mother's lips trembled. "I was weak." "You were." They didn't scream. They didn't break. They just stood there, one in a bed, one on her feet, both carrying the same wound in different shapes. And then, softly, Maeve said, "I forgive you," not because it was easy, but because she had to, because forgiveness sometimes wasn't about the other person at all. She didn't stay long. 2 nights. Long enough to hear her mother cry in her sleep. Long enough to know the apology was real, even if it came too late to fix anything. On the morning she left, her mother reached for her hand. Maeve let her, then walked away. She didn't cry until she saw the hills again. The line of trees she knew by heart. The crooked fence Elias never bothered to fix. The porch swing creaking softly in the breeze. He didn't meet her at the gate, just left the door open and a cup of warm tea by the window. She stepped inside, hair loose, eyes dry. And for the first time, she stood at the threshold, let the sunlight fall across her shoulders, and didn't flinch when it touched her face. He came back on a Tuesday. Not loud, not drunk, just there, Burke Montrell, with the same grin, same eyes like rusted nails, and 2 men flanking him like shadows in leather. He wore a clean shirt this time, carried nothing in his hands but a folded paper and the kind of smile that meant something ugly was about to happen. They didn't ride through town. They walked, step by step, through the dust-choked square, letting every eye see them, letting the memory of last time trail behind them like smoke. No one greeted them. No one dared. Burke stopped outside the sheriff's office first, slammed the paper on the desk like it meant something holy. "She's still mine," he said. "Signed, sealed, promised." The sheriff didn't touch it, just looked at him and said, "You should leave." Burke laughed. "Not without what's mine." Word spread fast. IT always did by noon. Half the town had gathered near the market square. Stalls half closed. Mothers holding their children a little closer. Whisper Hollow didn't do crowds unless it was ready to watch something burn. Elias arrived alone, dust on his boots. Hands steady. He didn't carry a weapon. Just a rolled deed in one fist and a quiet that wrapped around him like armor. He walked past Burke without looking, stopped in the center of the square, and turned to face them all. "The ranch is hers," he said, not loud, not angry, just true. In her name, in ink, in law, in blood, if need be. Burke laughed again, sharp and hollow. "You think that stops me?" Elias didn't blink. "No, but they might." He nodded toward the crowd. A few men stepped forward. Not many, but enough. And then Maeve stepped out, hair down, shoulders squared. No scarf, no flinch. She didn't run, didn't shrink. She looked Burke in the eye and said, "You'll never own me again." Her voice didn't shake, and that, more than the words, broke something. Burke spat, looked around, and 01 moved, and 01 backed him. And for the first time, he saw what silence really meant in Whisper Hollow, that IT meant refusal, that IT meant exile, that he turned. Walked away. The dust took him without a sound. That night, the stars were clearer than they'd been in years. Elias lit a fire behind the barn, the one Maeve had painted blue, and set out 2 cups. No minister, no music, just a wooden ring he'd carved from an old pine branch, and her fingers, rough from the garden, steady as she slid it on. They didn't say vows. They didn't need to. He looked at her like she'd hung the moon. She looked at him like she'd finally come home. The fire cracked, the night held, and 2 people who had been broken before anyone knew their names finally became whole again, beneath nothing but sky, smoke, and quiet. If this story moved you, even just a little, let us know. Comment your favorite moment below, give the video a like, and subscribe to Cracks of Light so you never miss a story that matters. We tell these not because they're easy, but because they're real and someone out there still needs to hear them.